listed with additional standards. That's like that car wash I mentioned. There's a little something extra. So the way we read this, it says A 10.1-4. Guess what? That points you right to that page in Article 10 where that uses extra stuff is. And that probably, if I remember all the details correctly, I'm not trusting myself right now, okay? Chances are that talks about outdoor storage of vehicles that are wrecked and all kinds of stuff like that, okay? That's, those are typically concerns that show up with a major auto repair shop. So we go ahead and we address how to do that. Those are listed with additional standards in the C85, in the VSR, and the I&D, the industrial. VSR is that district that is created predominantly for auto-intensive, heavy, banging and clanging type of stuff. Auto repair, it could be plumbing contractor, where I don't swing by the plumbing contractor's, shop and do business. I might stop by to get a quote, but not typically. They're gonna deploy to my home or my business. So they've basically got a building with a bunch of maybe parts and equipment. They may have a shop where they can handle certain activities, and they probably have a bunch of vans or vehicles loaded with equipment and parts and everything else. So they're really vehicle intensive. Okay, they're really deploying or dispatching. ServPro, a plumbing contractor, an auto repair shop. The problem with a lot of ordinances that exist in North Carolina for some unknown reason is they will take all that kind of stuff and they will lump it into a good old-timey B2, Business 2 district. Right there in the same list with the barbershop, hair salon. But the use characteristic is quite different. One is more personal service. I'm going in and out of the bank. I'm going in and out of the barbershop. I'm going in and out of these service businesses. And then I've got all this equipment and trucks and everything else next door. So we create these districts that are based on character so that you can manage how those impact each other. And I have found it to be extremely popular with folks in those businesses. That's why I actually created it a number of years ago, was hearing feedback from auto repair shops that felt like they were being singled out and sort of lobbied against, and they've been there 30 years, and a day spa comes in next door, been there 6 months, and is complaining about the body shop next door, repair shop next door, and so the whole council's upset about the shop that's been there 30 years that's next door. And I'm like, well, they thought I'd come to shut them down. I said, no, I didn't come to shut you down. I came to figure out a solution. So what I did was I created their own district. So they had their own district with their own rights and privileges. And they could stay right there. But they couldn't expand without expanding that district. So it made it a decision. If something wants to expand, is it the right location or not the right location? It goes through the process. It goes to the planning board. It goes to the governing board. If they've got room on their property to expand, yes, they could expand. If they want to buy more property and buy out the salon, which is in a different character district, then they would need to go through a rezoning. So it's a conscious decision between these more pedestrian-oriented, customer-oriented places, and those places that are a little bit more dispatch and shop and sharp objects and things of that nature. So that's how these districts are crafted, and that's how these uses fit into them. Now we're going to take a moment and we're going to go to, on that same page, you're going to slide back up a little ways, almost to the middle hole in the ring binder, and you're going to find an asphalt plant. Asphalt plant. Asphalt plant is pretty heavy duty. It could even be considered by many to be pretty scary. So you notice it's not listed in any district until you get to the heavy industry overlay in the far right. And then you notice it's an S10.2 that .2 is code for special use permit. S, code for special use permit, you see? So that's a double layer of review. Let's suppose that you've got some property zoned industrial over here somewhere, and somebody decides they want to apply for the asphalt plant. If it's zoned I and D, look right next in that column just to the left of the HIO, look just to the left, and you'll see there's asphalt plant is not listed under the industrial column, but it is under the heavy industry overlay. So if I've got property over here zoned industrial, can I do the asphalt plant? Right. I have to go through first a rezoning to add that heavy industry overlay. And if the planning board and the governing board approve all that through a very public process with public hearing and notices and all that, then I have to come in with a special use permit application, which is quasi-judicial, and everybody spin your hat, goes to the Board of Adjustment. Remember that other role, the quasi-judicial role, where it's evidence-based. Now, you're just about ready for graduation from Zoning 101, so bear with me. Out there in that HIO, it says 10.2-6 and 16. So let's just take a quick look at 10.2-6. I'll tell you very quickly, it's in Article 10, of course, but it's on page 27. And there's some basic stuff right there. It's about a third of a page. It says right off, first of all, it's got to go in the HIO. It's got to have at least a certain amount of street acreage, street access, and a few other basics, okay? The type of buffer and everything. But remember, it also said 16. So now let's go over to 16, because 16 kicks in on more than just the asphalt plant. So it's not all about just asphalt plants. So I'm going to go to 16, 10.2-16. Let's see if I can get you a page number there.
37.
Page 41.
Oh. What's that 16 under? I think it's nothing like that.
I think it was number 16 underneath another
There.
article. There.
You might have been looking at 10.1.16.
No, it was 10.2. It was just under something different.
Oh. Well, if you look in Article 10, page 41, you'll see the beginning of 10.2.16. And notice what that's called. Remember, 10.2.6 was all about asphalt plant and had a few basics strictly about asphalt plants. 10.2.16 goes way deeper. It's about any type or category of hazardous industry. Any place that emits, whether it's odors, fumes, heat, whatever, waste of any kind, wastewater, contaminated stormwater runoff, anything like that, you'll notice gets into much more detailed set of standards that carries all the way over to the end of page 44. One of the requirements in here, just to kind of shortcut you from having to fish through all this detail, one of the requirements in the hazardous industry category, anything that requires the compliance with the conditions in 10.2.16, is a closure plan. A closure plan, for those of you that have been around any kind of industrial situation, is precisely what it sounds like. It's a requirement for that industry to deal with itself if it ever shuts down that facility. What do? I used to write closure plans when I was, way back when I was knee-high to just a little engineer, knee-high to a grasshopper. And I used to write them for predominantly industries that dealt with chemicals and metals. And the closure plan says, okay, all the pipe that touched any of the chemicals has to be removed and disposed of this way. All the concrete that touched any chemicals has to be processed, removed, and disposed of this other way. So it's a very specific thing. The EPA requires those. Okay? And so what we say is, where is it? We want it. Give it to us too. Rather than us sitting down and coming up with something separate, because theirs is far more detailed than if we added it to here. This would dramatically increase the pages in Article 10 if we spelled out what that closure plan is. We just tell them we want the same closure plan that you do for the feds. So the point is can you do an asphalt plant in an industrial district? Yes, if you can get the overlay. Yes, if you can satisfy all the requirements of the special use permit. So there is a process for that that makes sure. If you don't want it to happen, don't approve the overlay. Don't wait till you get to the special use permit. Boards got in a lot of trouble over the decades trying to deny special use permits that had a list of special conditions. If they meet those conditions, they're entitled to the permit. That's a quasi-judicial thing. It's evidence-based. If they submit the evidence and they meet those, they get it, period. But the zoning district is a legislative decision. You might say, well, you know, we're uncomfortable about it in that area. It's close to the edge of the watershed. It's close to this. It's bothersome. And so you recommend no, or you're whatever and recommend yes. The governing board gets it, and they hear from all the neighbors with the pitchforks and everything and torches. And they say, well, we got the planning board's recommendation that said no or yes or whatever it said, and we got these people saying this, and I'm not comfortable with it, and I'm voting no. The governing board can just vote no. They don't have to explain it. They don't have to justify it. That's why I put a rezoning in between before you get to the special use permit. You might have an industrial site, but you got to get the heavy industry overlay before you go through the permit process. So it puts a legislative step that makes it easy to make a general decision. Is that good in that area or not? Okay, so that's how I've sort of introduced you now to the way that Article 8 and the table work. And it goes like that for all the different stuff that you can imagine. And so when you read this, you're going to say, well, gosh, some of this sounds similar. There may be little differences. They're in there for a reason. You may need that when the question comes in. A town like Landis is not going to get 45 asphalt plants. You may never get one. But you may, if you do get an application for one, now you're equipped. And that list goes on. That's about 6 pages. Then section 2 begins, which is strictly manufacturing. And then section 3 begins, which is strictly wholesale and warehousing. Okay? So there's about 8 pages total in that table that stay folded neatly at the back of your Article 8, and your ruler will fit neatly in the binder at the front. So that is the introduction to Table 8.1. So we're working backwards into the way that somebody like your staff is going to do this. Because the next item on the agenda.
I have one question.
Sure.
For Table 8.1. So SIC.
Right, Standard Industrial Codes.
Okay. And then we just go search that number around that
The
as well?
Standard Industrial Codes, in case the administrator needs to dig a little bit deeper and making a determination, because the key is the administrator's interpretation. They are charged with interpreting and administering and enforcing the ordinance. And so we want to give them enough material to go by. So some industries have SIC codes,
Okay.
many things don't. You know, somebody could be using a name, well, we manufacture, you know, we're in the so-and-so industry, and our name is Nice Puppy and Kitten Industries. Well, if she's having trouble figuring out exactly how to categorize it, what's your SIC code? If your SIC code's 5100 or something like that, or 9000, you know right away, okay, I'm dealing with medical waste, I'm dealing with this, I might have an incinerator issue on site, and all those kinds of things that go with this pretty big building and all these jobs, that you just need to make a decision. Is it the right location for that? That's why I separate out. Some towns, which you're included, have 2 zoning classifications for industry. Some will have, not in your new zoning, in your old stuff. You'll have I-1 and I-2, light and heavy. It's a terrible idea. Because you're heavy, once you've zoned property heavy, and you don't have any standards for it, and they come and they want make a big mess, and people then want to get upset and go to the board and tell them they're going to vote them out for allowing it. Well, they didn't. You know, if the ordinance says it, or doesn't say it, if it's silent, that's what you have to go by. So if you don't want something somewhere, do not zone that category. Okay, and we'll say that again. If you do not want certain types of development in certain areas, don't put that zoning in place. Don't zone something for 3 units an acre of residential and then turn out opposed to a subdivision because it's 3 units an acre for residential. They have the right to do it as long as they meet the standards in the ordinance. And that's a big problem. People will zone stuff like right now. You know what y'all are covered in? Y'all are covered in R8. Covered in R8. Spencer up here, where I'm also doing this, is their whole ETJ away from the interstate. Their whole ETJ all the way to the Yadkin River is R8. There's no sewer out there, but it's R8. So, you know, and then they wonder why they're getting stuff that they really are uncomfortable with. You follow me? So that leads us, if I may, any other questions on the table? That leads us to the next big piece of the puzzle, which is the zoning map. You saw your future land use previously, and it's generalized. Employment areas could be industrial, they could be VSR, they could be commercial, they could be heavy industry. Your neighborhood stuff could be, you know, this SFR this or SFR that. But the zoning map takes that to the next level of detail. This becomes the law of the land, literally, the law of the land itself. And your whole territory has to be in some district. Everything except road right-of-ways. Okay? You can't leave something unzoned if you're thinking, well, we'll pick something out later. Unzoned means no standards. Okay? So you need to set a standard. So this map is a little bit busy. So I'm going to start over here and kind of walk you through a little example of what I mean by busy. There are property lines in here. And I'm just going to point to this area that's outside your jurisdiction right now. So it's easy, there's no other color. But then it's got these hatch lines through it. That's because you have watershed restrictions that hover over whatever zoning we put on the ground. They're like an extra overlay district that we don't even get to define. The state defines those. And those define some things about the amount of coverage on the ground, the amount of rooftop, paving, that sort of thing. And that has to do with protecting drinking water for folks downstream. Okay? So there's very little of Landis that doesn't fit within, and it's roughly right in here, it doesn't fit within a watershed area. And that's what Article 19 was that I passed out. But remember I said the other day, you already have this. This has been there since '89 when all this was required. There it is. We're not changing any of that. We're just codifying it into the new ordinance and then updating it for the 160D provisions on appeal and variance and stuff like that. Now, the grays are other jurisdictions that are municipal, like the city of Kannapolis, which is to the south, the town of China Grove, which is to the east and north. Okay? Now, whether that's inside the town limits or an ETJ doesn't really matter. It's inside their jurisdiction. If it's in white, it's actually not in a municipal jurisdiction, but in the county's jurisdiction. So the white areas are out in the Rowan County jurisdiction. I'll take just a moment to point something out. There are 4 watershed overlays areas in here. This is Kannapolis Lake, which has what's called a protected area. And it has a critical area. The critical area is really close to the lake, and it's more restrictive than the protected area that's further upstream to the top of that watershed. And then you have Lake Fisher over here, which is a different category altogether. And it has a critical area and a balance of watershed. They use a little different terminology between WS3s and WS4s. Okay? You have a 3 and a 4. That's the classifications by the state of these lakes and everything that runs into them. If I go outside and I pour a cup of water on the ground, it's going to make it to that lake if it doesn't evaporate or something else happen to it. You follow? So we have that hovering over us, like this extra little thing. This map, by the way, you have and would live at the back of Article 1. This is called the official zoning map. And it has a signature block on it, where once it's adopted, the mayor, the planning person, and our distinguished Amber will get to sign. And then it lives there in Clerk World and Planning World, and then you'll have all these in your books. So that's why you have that fold out that goes at the back of Article 1. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we put that IND on the ground. But you'll notice that not all the residential is yellow like on the future land use, because we kind of have to, we use a 16 crayon box on the zoning map and an 8 crayon box on the future land use because it's more general. Then you could be looking at employment area. Sure, we could zone that BSR or industrial, depending on what's going on. So the zoning is far more specific. 13 primary districts and 5 overlay districts. The overlays would all have another little colorful symbol that might look like anything from a scenic corridor to some kind of density of some sort, depending on what's going on. But the colors are your primary districts. Now, the first thing that normally happens when I unveil a zoning map is people get up and they come over here and they want to look and see how their house is zoned, or where their work is zoned, or something like that. But I want to walk you back through. Remember, in the old ordinance, it says that puppies and kittens, which in planning and zoning world would be, the warmest, nicest things would be schools and churches, or any district, okay, which is a wholesome sounding policy, but a terrible idea. Because then you end up with different standards for different churches, which is not a good practice when you got 2 pastors and ministers barking at you and wondering why one had to do something more expensive than the other one did. So we pull all those things into the civic district, which is the blue. That blue is all basically owned by nonprofit related things, governmental agencies, religious institutions, et cetera, et cetera. That's why, and that also tells your elected officials, wow, we got a lot of tax exempt property in the town. Now, in some cases, we found this in Visco actually owned a big giant piece of property that we're now packaging into a big development opportunity with a master plan to try to stimulate their local economy and housing market at the same time. So you never know what gets uncovered when you analyze it this way. And that's the way we back into it. We first pull out all the civic, and then we pull out all the current zoning for industrial. We don't change any of the current industrial zoning because we never know what might have been presented to the state or be in an economic development package that's confidential or something like that. The rest of it we look at from the standpoint of existing land use. Existing land use. That means what's here today. And if we've got a downtown area, and the darker blue is the private sector side of the downtown, and the light blue is the civic sector of the downtown, you'll notice that probably 40% of the property that's shown in your Main Street district is civic, in your Main Street area. So you've got a ton of town-owned, properties and things like that probably in there. You've got several industrial areas. We did not recommend changing any of those. If you tell us, we can change those. But right now they are zoned, we go by your old zoning map to make sure that we don't throw any big employment negotiations that are going on or anything like that under the bus. Now, on the residential side, and I saved that for last, we've got 4 real color options here. And I'm going to start with the sort of the lowest density. That's called SFR1. Okay? And SFR1, we have very, very little SFR1. And we base that on the sizes of the property, the lot sizes. This is your roughly acre-ish type development, and you don't have a ton of that inside your jurisdiction. Because SFR1 rhymes with approximately a unit per acre. SFR2, which is 2 units per acre, and certainly there's individual tracts in some of these areas that might be large enough to be SFR3, but we're not going to have 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 3 down the street. We're going to kind of round it off, if you will. So you'll see a lot of SFR2 in some areas where it's on average about 2 units per acre. Now we'll stop there for a moment and describe what else we do to that. We look at the individual lots, not every single one of them, but we will look in an area and we will select a couple of test lots to make sure that we are applying this correctly. And we will look at the acreage or square footage of those lots. And in SFR2, in your ordinance in Article 8, I think it's on page 10, there's a chart that says that the minimum lot size for SFR2 is 17,600 square feet. Now, if it's a lot of record, if it's already there, no problem, but you can't create new lots smaller than that. 17.6 yields about 2 units per acre. It's not a third of an acre. It yields about 2 units an acre because you've got road right-of-ways and all sorts of other things that come into play. The setbacks, the lot sizes, things of that nature, the last thing we want to do is create nonconformities. That is grandfather clause stuff. We want to make sure that this reflects pretty much the existing conditions out there so that people will not have trouble with refinance, insurance, any of those things that are subject now to the Dodd-Frank Act, where it's all about risk mitigation for financial industry. They take that very seriously now, and they should have a long time ago. But it's one of the silver linings of the recession. It actually helps property owners. Because a lot of towns would guess. They would go in here and they'd say, okay, we're going to zone that R8, which is like our new subdivisions. Well, if you've got these older parts of town where the pattern's established, you never know what you're throwing under the bus. And I want to get more and more into that. So the SFR 3 is a little higher density. And you see some new development and some existing development around there. Now, we didn't come in and fill in gaps with lower density because there were still larger parcels in there. We made kind of an assumption that this pattern would likely infill that area. This density, if it's been approved this far out, would likely filter back this way towards the residential Main Street transition. And I saved that best for last. The residential Main Street transition, this RMST district, which you'll notice is kind of all around the older parts of town. Surrounds the downtown, it's around the older parts of town. That is a set of standards that's really designed for areas that were established long before there was ever any zoning rule at all. Okay? When I was in Kannapolis, the county, I started their first town zoning there, okay, back in 1988. What I inherited was the county had applied a zoning district that had a 30-foot front yard setback to all those mill villages. Every one of those houses was built about 26 feet back. Every single one of them was a non-conforming building that would have had major issues if it had suffered any damage, tornado, fire, any of those things. Not to mention, under Dodd-Frank, getting refinancing, purchasing insurance, anything that means that building is a greater risk for that financial industry sector. So we come up, I call it the BZ era. These areas of town involve before zoning. And so we want to respect that. That's always my recommendation. So your zoning map is pretty close to existing land use conditions. What's there? With the exception of a few little gaps between some new development, some older development, where we zoned more towards the new pattern that's going on in that area. So those are some of the only areas that really we are recommending you go ahead and set yourself up for infill in those areas. Okay? Somebody's got 20 acres in there, and it's surrounded by 3 units per acre on one side, and the older parts of town with areas that are anywhere from 2 units an acre to 4 units an acre. Right there adjacent, I wouldn't zone that for farms. You follow me? So that's where that comes from. Same thing up in here, SFR2, because you got a lot of 2 along the existing road. When somebody punches in right there, manage that similar density in that area would be a starting point. Somebody may come back to you and say, well, we want to rezone to SFR 2. Excuse me, it's already 3. And we want a higher density. Then you can go through the process and make that decision or not, and recommend it to the board. So that is how the rubber hits the road. How the law of the land, this is what takes this book and glues it down somewhere in different aspects depending on where you are. The business districts are based on character. Landis, not unlike many, many other towns, has a B1, B2, B3 kind of thing in their zoning ordinance. And if I say to you, hey, have you got any property in the B2? You say, well, I got some in that B1. I wish I had some B2, but does anybody really know what I'm talking about? You have to pretty much work in it to know, or work in real estate or something to know what that difference might be. So what I do is I create character districts. So this red is your commercial along Highway 29. And I'm not smart enough to do this stuff the hard way. So I call this C29 instead of C1 or B1. It's C29, which says to you, this is about the character of Highway 29 development. Okay? We also have resting in there, should you ever find your way out there, because you're kind of creeping that way, to I-85, we have you a C-85 district built in there, because you are dancing with getting yourselves to 85 over time. And if you don't have the tool in the toolbox, then when you need it, it won't be there. Follow me? And that's an entirely different character of development. travel speeds are much greater. Sign standards and things of that nature are totally different. Okay? Little nuances like that. So your C29 in your table, as you look through there, you'll see that that's kind of that old school district. Now, we're talking about what is referred to in my adopted hometown as Cannon Boulevard. That's what this basically is. A national highway, which is this road right here. Does everybody know the national highway? Once upon a time, there was a railroad, and there was a trading path, and it followed a ridge, and it ultimately reached from Boston to New Orleans. And then, as the wagons and automobiles began to proliferate society, a road was identified that extended along that rail corridor from Boston to New Orleans. And I don't know who it was that invented numbering highways like 29 or I-85, but they hadn't been born yet. Or maybe they were still just little. So they named it instead of numbering it. And that is the National Highway right there. Later known as 29. Then when 29 was bypassed, it became 29 alternate. And then they dropped the 29 alternate. So now it's picked up its local names like Main Street, up in Spencer, Salisbury, places like that. It's, Salisbury Avenue and Spencer and things along that line. Okay? Main Street in Salisbury, that sort of thing. So you're on a very historical corridor right here. And I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert on it, but I know that because I have the deed for my office goes to the right-of-way of the National Highway from the 1920s. So there is kind of that introduction. You'll see these little mixed-use districts, and there's two. One's an MU1, one's an MU2. A mixed-use district is kind of is not necessarily to be used along a highway like 29 where you kind of got a pretty defined character to that highway. That mixed-use 2 might be a little menagerie of things. So it's kind of lighter commercial. People used to call it neighborhood commercial, things like that. So mixed-use 2, you could do some residential and some light commercial. Mixed-use 1 is mostly higher density residential, like townhomes or something like that, but not so much commercial. So MU1's lighter, MU2's more intense. You don't have very much MU1 at all. At all. You've got a few MU2s, mostly because you've got a little bit of commercial and some interesting locations that necessitated something that didn't open the floodgate. That way you can make a conscious decision about those floodgates. Do we want to open this up to more intense, to higher density, that kind of thing. That goes through here. So we start out by zoning people for success, not creating any more grandfather clause conditions than absolutely necessary. So we kind of have a clean slate. And then growth and development, you'll be looking at your future land use plan and saying, well, we got this area over here in SFR3 and they're wanting to do 4 units an acre. Well, that's when you pull out that T&D overlay. Remember that powerful tool that lets us say, okay, you really want to get past 3, then we're going to have some quality in there, because when you start really getting dense, you've got to pay very careful attention to the weeds, to every little detail. So that's where that goes. Up to 3, it's basic standards in the ordinance apply. Beyond that, T&D overlay, much greater detail. Folks, I want to just tell you about the next 2 items fairly quickly, and then I have a couple of closing comments. The Technical Standards and Specifications Manual sits in tab 24. A lot of towns will do this really ingenious thing, like say, well, you know, you have to meet the DOT standards. Well, that sounds really like, that sounds like something. But I tell you, DOT standards are not very difficult to meet. And they do not create good neighborhoods. They're more about moving traffic. Basically moving traffic. Nothing against DOT, but they're not, their job is not to design neighborhoods. Their job is to design highways and rural roads, thoroughfares. So that standards manual has a set of details. They printed sideways. They should have printed in a landscape format. I'll work with you on that so that we know how we get that to do that right. I don't know what happened there. But they should have, so that they use the whole page. Now, what actually happens, and you may not need them reprinted, we don't need to do that, we just want to make sure on the website that if I'm working for an engineer, let's say I'm a civil engineer over here at Concord Engineering or one of those places, and I've got a project to design a subdivision in Landis, and I'm gonna be designing all this street stuff, and I look up in Article 16 about subdivisions and 13 about streets, and it tells me that I gotta do it in accordance with the manual. And there's the manual right there on that same screen, in that same menu as my other development ordinance files. So all I gotta do is click on it, download those files, paste them in my drawing, and I'm finished drawing. Then when Shelley or Leonard or somebody here at Town Hall gets those plans, they don't need to say, well, gosh, you know, we need to compare these details to see if they meet our standards, because the engineer drew all these details. No. You look, see if they've got the logo on it, if they've got the town's name on it, and if they've got the town's name on it, it says Town of Landis, you know they used your detail, you're good. In other words, they are PDFs that they can patch on to their drawing. So we're not having to go through and take apart somebody's design drawings and figure out how do they compare to our standard, and spend forever doing it. So we can expedite plan review and we can ensure more consistency. I've worked in places before where they referred you to manuals that had more language than it did details, so we went ahead and drew the details. That's the way we do it everywhere. We draw the details. It's more efficient for smaller communities that don't have an engineering department with 4 engineers in there that can do all that stuff every day. You just basically, this way you can check those check boxes. Do they have our standard in there? Yes. Good. I'm done with that part. You see? So that's what that manual is. It goes a step further, and it does those streets that we talked about. Remember when we were talking about that a couple days ago? On the screen, the street cross-section, the planter strips, the sidewalks, where the street lights go, where the street trees go, that's all in there. It's all on this drawing. We've got commercial streets and we've got residential streets. Now, it may be that a street needs to be wider where it has an intersection or something like that, and that detail is worked out in plan view, but the thickness of the pavement, planter strip requirements, street light locations, handicap ramps, all those things are standard. So that's that manual. It lives outside the ordinance as a reference, and it lives outside the ordinance because sometimes products change. So let me use an example. Let's suppose that asphalt mix, let's say the DOT stopped buying S9.5D. That's a mix. Mix is a certain size stone or aggregate, and a bituminous or oil-based pudding that they cook. I'm going to simplify it. That's what asphalt is. They cook up a pudding that's got some stoning, little, big, and small. Depends on the type of mix. For all practical purposes, that formula changes from time to time. And when it does, we don't want that written in our ordinance, where we have to then go through the ordinance and change that. We want it in a manual where we simply substitute the asphalt cross-section of stone. We just say, here's the new standard that the plants are making. We can easily, the engineer might say, this is what we need right here. We need this mix instead of that mix. I see ordinances all the time that actually put it in the ordinance, and the only way, and then, so it's law. What if they don't even make that mix anymore? But it's the law in that town. You see why I do the manual sits outside? And it would be amended typically by staff. If staff is getting feedback or getting a bulletin from, DOT or the state or somebody like that about, be aware of this, be aware of that on sewer line pipes or whatever, then they know, they can deal with that. That doesn't really need to go through planning board and governing board, because what's the governing board gonna do? So I vote no, we're gonna demand that you go find somebody that can make this old-timey mix? Yeah, that's not realistic. Okay? So that's why the manuals sit outside. The last item that I want to introduce to you tonight, period, actually, not tonight, period. The last item. Can y'all believe that's where we are? This is it. It should be living in front of Article 1 as just a place, a convenient place, and it's called a Statement of Consistency and Reasonableness, and it's got 2 yellow lines near the top of it. One-page little document that you were distributed. It looks like this. Everybody got that? It's a little one-pager, doesn't have a watermark on it. Awesome.
And where do we put that in one?
I'd stick it in the front of 1,
Okay.
just as a place for it to hang out.
Okay.
When I first met you, when I first met you, I talked about 160D and all the requirements that 160D has brought to the table. This is one that was actually already on the books, but is underscored with greater importance under the statute. And it's the statement that the governing board will ultimately need to make when it adopts the new ordinance. It will need to also adopt a statement that ordinance, that it is finding that ordinance is consistent with the plan that it adopted the month before. Okay? And the way the statute is written is it actually, the wording says that implies that this is a separate item. Because I would love to just edit this into Article 1 and be done and make it a part. But the statute implies that it is a separate action. So I recommend 2 votes. When you recommend this ordinance, or in the future, when you recommend a change to the ordinance, or when you recommend a change to the zoning map, also known as a rezoning, you have to send one of these with it. Okay? And they are statements attesting to its consistency and its reasonableness whenever a map is involved. Remember I said for the governing board to change this, they have to justify it. That's what that page is about. That's where they will do that in the future. The page for a single property might look entirely different because it's talking specifically about that area, specifically about that property, specifically about the situation in that locality. In this case, it's talking about the whole town, and so it's a bigger, broader stroke, if you will. And the statute's clear about that. When it's a large-scale rezoning, they refer to it as, that it is more generalized than it is when it's a specific piece of property. So that, Mr. Chairman, I hope I spelled your name correctly.
You have.
Thank you.
Yes, you have.
All right. Because your name appears on that, and then your name appears on page 1 of Article 1. No, it doesn't. I'm sorry, the mayor. Only that's reserved for the mayor and Amber. Amber gets to sign everything. Her name is going down in infamy in the history of Landis forever. The permanent. Remember your permanent record when you were in grade school?
Yeah.
That's what her job is. She keeps the permanent record for the town. Okay?
Awesome.
So with that said, and after several months of y'all listening to me yammer on up here, that concludes the presentation, introduction, and review of your draft development ordinance and all of its accessories.
Thank you, that was a lot of information.
I'm sorry. I'm
No,
so sorry.
No, you're good.
But I want all of y'all to join me at the city of Gastonia soon when I get started on theirs that is due in June.
Oh,
In June.
oh no.
They're just like you.
Oh, boy.
They're all due. Statewide, all the updates. Now, I'm not taking them through a new plan, but we're fixing their old ordinance.
Wow,
And I haven't started it yet because they're in line.
wow.
They're next. The one I started this week is the one I started this week. Columbus County
Wow.
is right behind the town I started maybe a month ago before that, Tabor City. And then after Gastonia, I start the town of Coates, all due in June. All those are updates except Tabor's. Theirs is a new one, but they're breaking it up. They're doing the essentials now, so they're going to adopt about 8 articles, and then we're going to take the rest of their old stuff and drop it into blank article pages, so it at least moves it into the same kind of 23 article organizational structure. So yeah, so y'all are ahead of, y'all are not in last place in the state. Don't feel bad. You've done a remarkable job considering you didn't get started really till around the holiday season almost. So.
Good, good.
And, no, this has been wonderful, and I greatly appreciate your time and going through all this with us.
Well, it wasn't free. He's paying for it.
I know, but I just still thank
Or
you.
you are.
Thank you, Mr. Barefoot.
It was a bargain, trust me. I knew that when we made it proposal.
Well, I would like to say this, and I think I'm speaking for everybody up here, but I think we needed somebody like you to walk us through this minefield, because there's a lot of moving parts to it that I'm sure all of us have learned some things for. And just as a personal note, tonight, things came together a little bit for me tonight when you brought the maps and when you brought out some of the articles and some of the tables that we had. Those connected a lot of dots for me, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. It makes much more sense now.
Well, starting out, I think I mentioned to you, we're going to land on a crescendo where it suddenly will gel, and because there's no other really way to do this. You can't write something like this in a once upon a time and then 400 pages later, the end. You can't. It doesn't tell a story. It's got to function more than tell a story.
So what are next steps? Finished yet, I sense. So we've got a few little loose ends, I think. What
That you need to bring up now or at your next meeting is the opportunity. Then, of course, you would, in this case of we talked about the plan earlier in tonight's agenda.
Right.
You know you've got one vote action on it to recommend that towards the board. After you do that, then you would take a similar action where you're recommending this ordinance, which is actually I don't know how many pages, I call it 400, it's probably about 350 page ordinance, including its map and all that stuff, and then you would have a separate vote to recommend the draft of the statement of consistency and reasonableness.
So it's sort of a consent agenda where,
So you have
rather than
3
voting
votes.
each thing individually, we're doing this more or less as the
This
package.
this is one ordinance, 123 article long.
The items we advertised for consideration by the Board of Aldermen at the next meeting will come to them recommended from this board.
This board has already recommended.
They've already done it, okay.
Tuesday night, you recommended that, and so we've touched up that change. You recommended it with the change in the number of members. We've made that adjustment. Amber has that ordinance to go with the Alderman's package and for the hearings and things of that nature. And I believe that advertisement started today. Something like that. So this board's finished with that, with the update of the old ordinance. And that's in the governing board's hands for their April meeting. And then, depending on this board's appetite for the plan, they may be acting maybe in April to send the Board of Aldermen a plan for their May meeting. and then to send the governing board the ordinance. Now, the only thing I'm gonna warn you about is, y'all need to come stand with me if we only give the governing board one night with all of this material.
I'm gonna be sick that day.
We could zoom you in.
Yeah, I was here Tuesday night, and I think I had a lapse at that moment. I do remember now.
Yeah, they've already voted on the draft
Right.
revisions to the old ordinance, which were to update the prohibited and exempt sign books that clarify the makeup of the planning. Is Tuesday, the 13th.
That's correct.
The night after the Board of Aldermen meet.
Oh, dear.
So if you vote next week, or excuse me, in 2 weeks on the 13th, it will be May 10th, second Monday, that the Board of Aldermen would host a legislative hearing on the plan. And then possibly we'll be able to schedule some work sessions with them once we get this moving out.
My personal experience, and I did do this as a planner and later as a manager many years ago. I think the board, particularly with having Ashley Stewart here, and I've been in communication with board members individually, they're putting a lot of faith in you and Rick to do this. So I don't anticipate they're needing a lot of, you do a very good job, but you ought to as much as you've ever done in this line of work. So my hope is we can do it. Yeah, well, I hope we can get it done in one meeting, so.
Okay.
Thank you for those words. That makes me feel a lot better because I'm always nervous. Well, I'm just going to give you an example. Troy Planning Board recommended theirs in November, and they've adopted their plan last month, but their ordinance is slated for May, so that's going to put them 6 months behind their planning board.
Well,
Just to give you an example of what I normally deal with. Same or similar in Rutherfordton, their planning board voted in November. Their governing board approved in early March their ordinance and had earlier approved their plan. So it's not uncommon for me to be nervous about the timing, how much time a governing board wants it. But I'm thankful that you've had an alderman that was willing to attend these and be able to represent the aldermen here and present probably back to them a comfort level with what they're seeing here. So it's been an honor for me. I'll be back at your meeting on the 13th, and the two things that'll be on the agenda will be the plan and the ordinance. The plan will have one vote associated with it and a little one-page character that vote occurs in, and then the development ordinance will also be on the agenda, but it will require two motions, one for the ordinance itself and one for the statement of consistency. If you elect to take it up. If you don't and want to continue that meeting to a subsequent date, then it would stay on there until you dispense with it. Okay?
Yeah, very good. Okay.
well, does anybody have anything else before we conclude? Well, then I'll definitely make the motion to adjourn.
Okay, we have a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.